September 7th, 1870. HMS Captain, pride of the Royal Navy and the very latest thing in technology, is battling her way through a storm off Spain. The pitching waves break over her decks with foaming white fury, and then the ship begins to lean, alarmingly further over with each pitch and roll. With a deep groan, the unthinkable happens. Captain rolls onto her beam ends, throwing men and equipment into the sea like toys. The newest and finest warship in the world is lost, and nearly 500 are dead. The sinking of HMS Captain was a disaster which shook the Victorian British public. It was a huge blow to the nation's reputation as ruler of the waves, and her wreck has never been seen since. But the ship's sinking was really just a tiny part of a fascinating story, and now, all these years later, a dedicated team is working hard to find Britain's missing warship. They've come painstakingly close. An expedition in 2022 captured this image, a wreck off the coast of Spain, battered and broken. Could this be it? Could this be the long-lost HMS Captain? To learn more about this incredible story, you really have to start at the beginning when the ship was being designed in a truly unique time and place. I visited the University of Wolverhampton to speak with Dr. Howard Fuller, historian and captain expert who's leading the charge to find the missing ship and solve the great mysteries that still surround her sinking. Can you give us a bit of a background on the work that you do and how you came to be here in Wolverhampton and studying this really interesting topic?
So I'm a reader in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. I had a fetish for ironclads, and I've been teaching war studies, so I have a module on the American Civil War. I've been teaching war in the modern world. And finally, for my last monograph, the idea was to, tackle the captain's story, but put it in the context of a larger, like say, the turret versus broadside debate. And the sort of climax of that debate, terrible climax of that debate, is the foundering of the captain.
The debate between turret and broadside warship designs came to a head in the 1860s, and naval technology was rocketing forward at an unprecedented level. On one side, the proponents of ships that mounted revolving turrets, but on the other, supporters of a more tried and tested approach that would see ships mount rows of guns along their sides like they had for centuries. In England and elsewhere, it resulted in a rapid-fire approach to design in the quest to avoid being outdone on the international stage. HMS Captain was the brainchild of Cooper Phipps Coles, war hero and inventor, but there were so many issues with the design that the British Admiralty refused to back him.
Almost an unspoken question, certainly an unspoken answer, is how could they have built such a thing? It's so obviously unseaworthy. It doesn't make any sense that people would pressure, the Admiralty to go against their instincts and build something that they didn't want to build, apparently. What I found in my own research was that when you realize what was going on in Europe, in North America, things like the American Civil War, things that were going on in terms of technological changes, and you get a greater sense of just how unnerved a lot of mid-Victorians were feeling, then you begin to understand how Coles and his supporters were able to sort of play on that.
Rapid advances overseas and the deployment of radical vessels like the Confederate CSS Virginia began to make the British public feel as if their navy was being left behind in a fierce arms race.
For the first time, there was this idea that if you were caught behind in a technological development like a new gun or a new way of forging armor or attaching armor or configuring armor, that you would send a ship full of men into combat with a ship that would just be, technologically superior, like categorically superior, not like, a third rate takes on a first rate or something like this. This is different. And that ship could be blown to pieces within minutes. So one of the devastating things, of course, at the time was in March 1862, the Battle of Hampton Roads. So the first day, an ironclad warship, basically a ship with shields, obliterates two very heavily armed, wooden warships at point-blank range, rams them, blows them to pieces, and steams back into port later that night, relatively unscathed. And that devastated people back in Britain. It was front page in the Illustrated London News because the implications were clear. That if we don't want the same kind of disaster happening to us as is happening to, the Americans, or at least the United States, we need to be doing something.
Leveraging popular and political support, Coles put forward his idea for an ocean-going turret battleship as the next logical step in warship development, the kind of invention that could save Britain itself. He was eventually able to get his design formalised and approved for construction, but it would mean working with the chief naval constructor, Edward James Reed.
Reed was sort of dismissive of the sensation coming back from North America, the news of the Monitor and the Merrimack, where everybody was talking about turreted vessels. And the idea of putting a turret on this sort of low freeboard raft-like platform, in particular, he said, no, we can't be doing that because that's a floating battery and we're the British Navy and we don't operate on floating batteries.
Reed had, at 33, become one of the most important figures in naval architecture for the Navy and oversaw the completion of some pioneering British warships. His mindset centered on the idea that the Royal Navy had to be able to fight on the high seas and that turret ships, with their clunky, heavy turrets and tiny freeboard, were far too cumbersome, dangerous even, in big seas. Instead, Reed led the development of ships that were similar in style to the fighting ships of old, with their sides festooned with guns, and one of Reed's designs was the groundbreaking HMS Warrior.
The Warrior's got it right in terms of its high freeboard, its seaworthiness, its speed, its full spread of sail that we can send anywhere fairly safely. They weren't quite sure if the Warrior would be that seaworthy because, the iron hull, the extreme length, how's the armor going to react with its seakeeping abilities? No one knows how this is going to work. And they don't have computer projections. They have math. And they're doing their best to predict how this should go. But there was a lot of doubts even about Warrior. But when the Warrior succeeds, for all intents and purposes, there's still an immediate criticism of the fact that it's only now got 4.5-inch armor plating. It's only armed with 68 pounders or 110 pounder breech loading rifles, which again is highly experimental technology, which fails as it turns out later. So Reed's solution is we don't need turrets. We just need to consolidate the armor better, save some weight, and the extra weight can go into slightly thicker armor in a central box, more of a box, let's say, than the Warrior, fewer guns than the Warrior, and therefore maybe some heavier guns, therefore. We don't necessarily need turrets because anyone, not just Reed, but anyone can quickly point out that if you go with Cole's design, which he's now sort of hitting the Admiralty with, these sort of sketches really, of cutting down a ship of the line or something and putting turrets on it. First, it's a floating battery because it has no masts and sails. If we try to put masts and sails on it, and he seems to be dabbling with the idea, how are the turrets supposed to operate? And until he comes up with a solution like that, we have no choice but to simply try to increase our gunpowder and increase our shielding as best we can as a modification of the Warrior, essentially. Or he starts creating these, what historians now call central battery ironclads.
This differing approach to ship design in an era where there were no hard and fast rules led, inevitably, to a bitter conflict between both parties, and at the center of it all were Coles and Reed.
Reed is controversial and a little bit touchy and sensitive by the fact that he's not essentially an experienced shipbuilder. He's extremely young, and he's kind of an outsider. He's been trained as an architect. He's done the right thing, and he's already got connections with the new Institute of Naval Architects. He's an editor. He's a good writer. He's a very good public speaker. He's a bit of a player. But at the same time, he's kind of an outsider with Navy people. Coles is a Navy person. Coles is a war veteran. Coles is extremely creative. He's persuasive. He's very ambitious. He can push hard on his ideas. And to Coles, I think the idea was more, well, look, Reed, my ideas must be right, and you are a naval architect. I want you to make my ideas work. So you and the Controller's Department of the Royal Navy should just be taking my ideas and making them work. Reed, on the other hand, would say something like, well, I'm the chief constructor. I report to the Controller of the Navy, Rear Admiral Robert Spencer Robinson, and you're kind of an outsider. Turrets are one thing. Building a whole ship that can carry them in the way that you think they can be carried is another. And frankly, when we want to build something like that, we'll build it. You build the turrets, we'll build the ships, thank you very much. So as a result, Reed is pushing broadside ironclads. Coles is left sort of marginalized, and thus begins this animosity. Because Coles is going, if we keep building ships like Reed has in mind, we may get caught in an awkward position someday if we ever get into a fight with the Americans, which at that time seemed pretty likely, or we might get involved in some kind of scrape with the Russians in the Baltic, again, over Poland, or these various crises developed, or the French, in which case it'll be a disaster.
Cole's ideas got more and more traction, but there were some obvious issues with his designs. If the Royal Navy were to give Coles what he wanted, there would need to be some serious concessions somewhere, because it seemed impossible that one design could have all the things that Coles wanted to see in a single fighting ship.
In a way, the weight of the guns, their hitting power, the thickness of the armor becomes more important than the sort of sea-keeping abilities of the ship itself. Keep the thing watertight, it's going to have reserve buoyancy enough, but it'll never have enough coal to go very far. It's completely dependent upon its engine, so there has to be multiple engines in there as fail-safes, including multiple engines just for ventilation, like forced artificial ventilation. If you're content with that, fine. You've got an impregnable warship. By all intents and purposes, it lives strictly for its guns and armor. But the Royal Navy can't do that.
Reed was essentially forced to design and build a turret ship more in line with Cole's ideas, but the resulting amalgam of both men's philosophies, HMS Monarch, pleased neither. Coles even refused to endorse the design at all.
He goes to the press on this. He writes he takes offense with a public talk that Reed gives, which seems to ridicule the turret. So Coles responds. This has kind of been going back and forth now. They're giving talks at various institutes. They're being followed by reporters. They're writing opinion letters in the press. Different newspapers are sort of arguing against one another. And when he finally critiques Reed's ship and just says, well, he's building inferior ships. Look what other navies are building. Even the Russians are building monitors now. How are his ships going to do against a Passaic-class Russian monitor? This kind of thing. It still makes Reed look like he's literally jeopardizing the country's naval supremacy by building an inferior grade ship at huge expense. Mind you, these ships are increasingly expensive as well. So the Admiralty look at this, and Reed is mortified. He says, now I'm being publicly, humiliated by a naval officer that's on our pay, and I'm a chief constructor. Do I get to respond to him? Because if I do, I'm going to tear him to pieces. How far is this going to go? And at that point, yes, the controller and everybody else is infuriated, and they're just like, Coles has gone too far, and he gets sacked. They basically let him go, and he's forced to basically make a choice between either coming out and apologizing, or sort of endorsing what's been going on, or quitting, altogether. And as we know, he does make an apology. He does say, well, I didn't realize that I was, destroying his reputation. I was just simply pointing out that, the facts are facts, and our ships aren't as good as, in terms of guns and armor at least, than other ships that we may have to fight with someday. And then having done that, it's at that point in early 1866 that the first naval lord, Gray, says, you know what, maybe we should just let Coles design the ship that he says we need to have. And at that point, it's basically a Monarch, but Coles is now becoming increasingly fixated on the lower and lower freeboard, saving the weight by submerging more of the ship below the waterline, using the extra weight towards thickness of armor on the whatever's left of the exposed waterline and the turrets and even heavier guns. And they finally said, fine. And that's what happens.
The end result of this was a design proposed by Coles for a warship with turrets that was designed not for coastal defense, but to take the fight to the enemy, something that could combine all the benefits of ocean-going warships, the likes of which Reed had designed, with Coles' vision of ultimate firepower at sea. But Reed and the Admiralty were ultimately forced to go along with the plan. They had obvious objections, partly motivated by Reed because of injury to his professional pride. But the main objection was around the many conflicting features of the ship which threatened to make it a ponderous, expensive coal-powered white elephant. Looking at Captain's plans, you get a real sense of modernity. Coles wasn't totally on the wrong track. Today we know that turrets were the future. Captain's design called for a long, slender hull with its gun deck so low to the waterline that a bridge-like structure would need to be built above so that the crew could get from one end of the ship to the other in rough weather without being swept overboard. The freeboard, that is the amount of ship actually above the waterline, was meant to be around 8 feet, or 2.4 meters, but in the event the ship was overbuilt with weight that was unaccounted for and she sat a half meter or 22 inches deeper in the water than was originally planned. This kind of error in construction might seem ridiculous now, but in an age before precision building techniques and computer-assisted design, working under such intense political and social pressures, it seems almost forgivable, or at least it would, if it hadn't resulted in the loss of hundreds of lives. Reed grew gradually more appalled by the design and refused to even approve the drawings that came by his office, simply marking them with "no objection is seen." Towering over the ship were enormous iron masts that reached 100 feet high with massive tripods to support them. That way, if Captain's steam engines should fail, she would at least be able to make it home on sail alone. But of course, down on the deck were the two simply enormous revolving turrets that weighed around 160 tons each. It was a lot of weight up high on a hull that barely rose above the surface of the water itself. This on a ship intended to steam through the big seas of the North Atlantic and the relentless rolling of the Bay of Biscay. Reed and his supporters probably expected the ship to fail, that it would be badly inefficient, too sluggish to do any good and keep up with the fleet. They probably didn't expect it to be lost on its first real voyage, with nearly all hands. Captained by Victoria Cross winner Hugh Burgoyne, and with Coles himself aboard, Captain was delivered to the Navy and put out on exercises. Then, off Spain, a blow came on so strong that the small fleet was scattered. In the morning, all ships but one had returned. Captain and her entire crew were gone. From the water was fished an enormous 16-foot-long white ensign flag, and then finally a single boat was found cramped with bedraggled crew members with a startling story to tell. Captain had rolled. In the big waves, those massive towering masts that sent her onto her beam ends and the turrets had pulled her down. Around 472 lives were lost, chief among which was the vessel's own designer, Cooper Phipps Coles. The resulting outrage stunned the Victorian public. We've actually covered it in more depth on another video on this channel before, but amazingly, this fascinating ship has never been seen again. But of course, she's still out there, and Dr. Fuller thinks he knows where. Off Cape Finisterre, Spain, is something that local fishermen have been complaining about for years. They say they've been snagging their nets on something big that lies just a couple of 100 feet below them. In 2022, Dr. Fuller worked with a team that sent a ship equipped with side-scan sonar out, and the hunt for Britain's long-lost turret battleship was on.
We started off with sort of traditional shipwreck hunting research, which is go through existing records, ship's logs, try to plot courses, watch the clock. Where were these ships at, 5, 10, 15-minute intervals, so that the ship founders about 15 minutes after midnight on September 7th, 1870, whereabouts would the captain have been in relation to the other ships in the squadron at that time. And so we did that. We did all of our field research, and we mapped it all out. We plotted it. We calculated speeds. We tried to take into account wind and current and everything we could. And our search box was putting us kind of out in this range, right? And I was contacted by a Spanish documentary film crew. They were telling me that we think we know where the wreck is. And so I said, why don't we combine our efforts? I said, and we'll help. You help us, we'll help you. It makes sense that the areas that they had mapped out were still on this continental shelf, because that's as far as their trawlers would really go, that they would be snagging rets on anything on the bottom of the surface. They go off the continental shelf, you drop 1,000 meters, and they're just not going to be doing the same fishing. So all the stuff that they had snagged on was still on the shelf. And one of those was big, and it was just on the edge. So we did go down, and they hit 4 shipwrecks in 4 hours. And the last one was over 90 meters, which again, it's a very large wreck. It's not just a fishing trawler. What's a big ship like this doing out here? And when we began hovering around the wreck and doing the multi-beam on it, it seemed to come through that this wreck had a very prominent voxel, and that the midsection was very low, and they even suggested that there might be some nets or netting that might be coming through on the scan. There might be some kind of like netting floating around the wreck. So maybe it's masts, tripod masts even.
It was a compelling image. There, just a few hundred feet deep and within sight of the shore, lies a wreck that seems to match Captain's dimensions and general appearance. Could this be Britain's missing turret battleship, the ship that Coles had fought so hard to build, but now exists as a tomb for nearly 500 men? Dr. Fuller and his team were about to find out. After an intensive fundraising effort and even acquiring a chartered research vessel, there was a last-minute delay, and the charter had to move on. It was a devastating moment. The wreck was so near and yet so far, and still, that mystery wreck is still down there, waiting for someone to confirm its identity. But in 2025, all these years later, what could even discovering the wreck of the Captain actually teach us?
It's got Victorian hubris written all over it. I mean, part of the lure, you could say, of the Titanic story, you watch A Night to Remember, or you watch James Cameron's Titanic. We love watching, stuffy Edwardians defy Mother Nature to their peril, and the sea has the last laugh. And there's a great moral lesson to be learned there: humility, technology or science in the face of Mother Nature. That's timeless. Mortals punished by the gods. How far back in storytelling do you want to go? So there is something deep there that resonates with people, and the Titanic story has been, very poignant because of that, among other reasons. The Captain story is very much so exactly the same thing. These are two cataclysmic events. The sea reasserts itself.
Beyond these lessons in humility, though, Captain has much to teach us about her own flaws and faults and the actual reason for her sinking. Dr. Fuller says that an analysis of the hull could, in some ways, even change the story. If bilge kills weren't fitted by the builders, for example, then it would have flown in the face of Cole's design, and their omission could have been partly responsible for her terrible role and eventual loss. For now, the mystery wreck will hold on to its secrets, but Dr. Fuller and the Find the Captain organisation are hard at work raising funds and doing all they can to bring the Captain's story to life. I was extremely pleased to get to meet Howard and talk about this fascinating ship. He was even kind enough to bring a collection of interesting artifacts from the era, including real-life original cannon shells, which I can confirm weigh an absolute ton. Recently, the organisation has had a few exciting wins. When Captain was lost, that 16-foot battle ensign was fished from the sea, but that flag wasn't totally lost to history. It was hung up in Captain Hugh Burgoyne's local church at Bedfordshire, where it stayed all those years. This incredible bit of history is being fully restored thanks to the efforts of the University of Wolverhampton, the Find the Captain organisation, and the University's Centre for Historical Research. It's set to go on display this year before eventually being returned to its Bedfordshire home. But probably the most exciting update has been the work done on this spectacular painting by maritime artist Geoff Hunt. Mr. Hunt is a legend in his field, having painted many spectacular maritime scenes, with his work being used for the covers of the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brien. These served as the inspiration for the film Master and Commander, one of my favourites. Working directly with the university, Mr. Hunt has completed a heart-stopping, terrifying depiction of the moment Captain rolled. It's an emotional and dramatic work, and it can be yours. Find the Captain is selling magnificent museum quality prints with all proceeds going towards the effort to find the lost ship. I'll put a link to these beautiful prints in the description below. Dr. Fuller has also written the first in-depth academic analysis of the Captain's story in Turret vs. Broadside. It's a story that really has to be read to be believed. It's a drama fit for stage and screen, and yet few have ever heard of it. Out there, somewhere, lies the wreck of HMS Captain. We can only hope that soon, very soon, we might finally learn what really happened to the mighty turret warship. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.